The Creaking is the newest horrifying addition to Minecraft, but according to Mojang, it also hides a secret. It's a weeping angel of sorts that emerges out of nowhere and stalks the player as they explore the new pale forest biome. If the player is staring, the Creaking will stare back, immobile, but turn your head for just a second and this thing will stop at nothing until you're dead. The mechanic is super interesting, but it's more than just some new unique gimmick, because understanding the Creaking and uncovering the secret that Mojang is hiding is a crucial puzzle piece in figuring out the lore and true story of Minecraft. So who better to leave it to than WIFEORY, the show that always goes for the heart. And that's exactly where we should start today, because if you want to find the secret of the Creaking and what lore Minecraft is hiding, we first have to understand the Creaking heart, because it explains a lot about the Creaking's true nature. The Creaking heart is a wood-like block with this weird orangey stuff in the center. At nighttime, if surrounded by 2 logs, the heart will summon a Creaking from out of the ground. Otherwise, these guys can't spawn. But this should immediately set off some alarms in your head, because it's very similar to something else you're probably familiar with, the warden. And this parallel is super important. In my video uncovering the secret of the warden, I theorized that the warden was a giant clump of skulk, bones, and souls that the skull catalyst pulled together in order to defend itself. And I think that's also exactly what we're seeing with the Creaking here. It isn't a real living thing, it's a clump of twigs, wood, and resin created by the Creaking heart in order to protect itself. That is to say, the Creaking is just a puppet. I mean, just try and see what happens when you kill the thing, which by the way, you do by breaking the heart. When you kill a Creaking next to a skull catalyst, a block that literally uses the life force of dead things to grow skulk, it can't grow anything. The catalyst blooms, meaning it did sense that something died. However, since no skulk actually grew, we can infer that the Creaking doesn't have any life force the catalyst can use. And there's actually something else that triggers a similar reaction in the catalyst: armor stands. Breaking an armor stand next to a skull catalyst caused it to bloom, but no skulk spreads because of course an armor stand isn't alive. So since this bloom but no spread phenomenon is only triggered by armor stands and Creakings, then it should already somewhat convince you that the Creaking here isn't as alive as it looks. And this makes sense if you think about how the Creaking operates. Each Creaking is connected to its own heart, which you can find by hitting it and observing where the trail of particles goes. While connected to a heart, the Creaking can't take any damage at all. It's actually a super fragile mob and is listed as only having a singular half heart of health, but despite that, when you attack it, nothing happens. It doesn't take damage like any other mob, and that would make perfect sense if this thing really isn't alive and is just the heart trying to protect itself, just like the skull catalyst protects itself with the warden. But that's not all. Similarly to how the skull catalyst has to send the warden back into the ground after a few minutes of inactivity because it isn't strong enough to keep it together, the Creaking heart also can't keep the Creaking alive forever. However, this time the limit is in the form of a radius. Even if you look away, the Creaking absolutely refuses to travel 32 blocks away from the heart. Why? Well, if it goes any further, it just dissolves. The heart isn't powerful enough to sustain a Creaking that's that far away, and since the Creaking's only job is to guard the heart, why would it ever have to go that far in the first place? There's no need for it to travel so far out if all it is a defense mechanism. But you don't have to take my word for it, because this was literally confirmed verbatim by Mojang developer Nembon during Minecraft Live.
The Creaking doesn't exist on its own. It's more of like a puppet of the new block, the Creaking heart.
So now we know for sure that the Creaking is a puppet, but that still just transfers our initial question to the heart. The Creaking being a puppet isn't the secret that Mojang is hiding. The secret belongs to the heart itself. So if we want to figure out what it is and understand the true story of Minecraft, we have to figure out what the Creaking heart actually is. Because it isn't just some creepy wooden block. It's very much alive. In fact, this detail is so important to the lore that Mojang didn't just mention it once offhandedly, they dropped it twice on 2 separate occasions. On both of these official Minecraft pages, they describe the Creaking heart as a living block. And this is further confirmed by what happens when you break the heart. Not only do you get XP, you get Monster Hunter. Not by killing the Creaking, by breaking the heart. The heart is the monster here. But that realization still doesn't give us the full story. It doesn't tell us how this thing came to be and what its secret actually is. For that, we have to turn our attention connection to resin. Resin is one of the new blocks that came out in this update, but more importantly, it's also what you get when you break the Creaking heart. In fact, we can confirm the heart is made out of this stuff because that's exactly how you craft it: 2 logs and a block of resin. And I'll get to why this is so important in a second, but this isn't actually the only way that resin appears in the wild. When you hit a Creaking connected to a heart, the heart secretes some resin onto the blocks around it, just like damaging a real-life tree. That's a neat detail, but now we're stuck in a sort of chicken and egg situation. We know you can make a Creaking heart by crafting it out of resin, but you can only get resin by breaking or using a Creaking heart. And if you want to find out what the heart is hiding, we have to know which of the two came first. But luckily we don't have to theorize because it's literally spelled out for us. One of these 2 blocks can be found somewhere else, and it all comes back to the Illagers. In most theories you'll find about Minecraft lore, the Illagers are usually either the villains or play some equally important role, and this time is no different. Because guess what you can find naturally generating in the chests of the Illager woodland mansions? Resin. This detail outright confirms that the Illagers and Creaking heart have some kind of history together. But okay, you may be saying it doesn't necessarily prove anything interesting. Maybe the Illagers just went on expeditions into the Pale Garden, collected some resin from the heart, and put it in their chests, and that's why it's there. No more, no less. And if this was the only connection between the two, then yeah, I'd say that makes sense. But it isn't. Resin isn't the only thing that ties Illagers to the Creaking. Notice what happens when you spawn a Creaking next to a bunch of Illagers. They run away in fear. Even the Johnny Illager, the mob literally coded to be violent against everything, has conflicting feelings about the Creaking. Few other mobs in the game have this sort of aggro or fear response, but when they do, it's almost always significant to the lore. Endermen attack Endermites because they're the parasites that corrupted them, and Piglins run away from the soul stuff because it triggers some PTSD from Steve. That's to say, whenever you see a mob running away from another one, it's almost always lore related, and this time is no different. It'd be one thing if the Creaking attacked these guys, and then it would make sense to run away, just like villagers running away from the violent Illagers. But the Creaking doesn't attack the Illagers. It literally couldn't care less about them, yet for some reason they're still terrified of it. And the connections between the two don't end there. We can read on the wiki that the Pale Garden is a derivative of the Dark Oak Forest, the biome where, as you know, Illagers live. And this makes perfect sense when you look at the trees. They're near identical in shape, except there's one important difference between the biomes. Illager woodland mansions do generate in Dark Oak forests, but don't generate in the Pale Garden. The Illagers clearly have some history with this biome and the Creaking, but want no part in it whatsoever. And now all the puzzle pieces are finally coming together, and we're super close to finding out the secret of the Creaking that Mojang is keeping hidden, the mysterious connection between the Illagers and the Creaking heart. All we need is one more puzzle piece, and for that we have to go back to where we started this whole thing. Sculk. Sculk and resin are weirdly very similar. The Sculk catalyst is a block that, as we established, uses the life force of the dead mobs around it to grow Sculk and protect itself with a warden. The Creaking heart, on the other hand, also has a very similar functionality. It uses the life force of things around it to grow resin and protects itself with a Creaking. But wait, okay, how do we know the heart actually uses the life force of other things? Well, for that, we can take a look at the formation of resin a little bit more closely. I mentioned earlier that when you damaged a Creaking, its heart would produce resin, but this isn't the full story. If the Creaking is in lava or gets hit by a warden, resin won't form. The only way that the resin is actually produced is if the Creaking gets hit by a player's dog, or a player's explosion, aka resin is only formed when the Creaking is hit by something with a player's soul. But if that wasn't enough evidence that this thing feeds off of life energy, there's another block that gives it away. Eye blossoms are the flowers that generate in the Pale Garden, and when they open, they have this very Creaking, resin-y type color scheme. This is nothing to gawk at on its own, but what's really interesting is that when bees try and pollinate the eye blossom, they take poison damage, as if the flower is sucking the life force out of them. And it's really not too much of a stretch to imagine that maybe this is also what happened to the Pale Garden. I mean, just Mojang calling this thing a garden and not a forest should tip us off that maybe this biome wasn't always so lifeless and might be more man-made than we thought. Maybe the reason that it looks this way and that no peaceful mobs can spawn in it is because the Illager made Creaking Heart sucked all the life out of a normal dark oak forest, and with that realization, we've nearly cracked the code. There's just one more tiny detail we're missing before we can fully know the secret of the Creaking, and that detail is why. Why did the Illagers create such a horrible thing in the first place? That's the secret Mojang is hiding, why the Creaking actually exists. And to solve it, the answer, one final time, comes in the form of the Warden. But before we crack this case wide open, I just want to ask that if you are enjoying the video, then please do consider subscribing. A ton of people watch these videos all the way through, but never actually end up subscribing, so it would really mean a lot to me if you could subscribe. I do genuinely appreciate it, and you can always change your mind later. But thank you so much, and back to the Warden. Short and sweet, in my video on the Warden, I discovered that this mob was the result of the experiments conducted by the ancient builders. Before we, the player, inherited this Minecraft world, an ancient race of Minecraft builders built most of the structures that we see today. Eventually though, their quest for power got the best of them, and they created something they couldn't control, the Wither. The Wither drove them into hiding underground, and in an effort to fight back, the builders created the Warden, a protector that could rival even the Wither in terms of raw power. They built the ancient cities as a way to live around the Warden, to pay tribute to their new god and revere it. However, it too eventually became something they couldn't control, and they were forced to evacuate to the end, leaving their cities to ruin. But okay, why is this all relevant to the Creaking? Well, it's because the Warden is literally what the Creaking wishes it was, and that's the key to solving this whole mystery. I already mentioned how their mechanics are pretty much the same, but the comparison goes so much deeper than I could have ever thought. Since before the Warden was the Warden, it was going to be a mob called the Stalker, and let me just read you the official description of what Mojang had planned for this mob. The Warden was originally called Stalker and would reside in a totem-covered biome where it would remain statue-like until some reckless player would try to grab its chest crystal, causing it to come to life. Brandon Pierce, the head developer, wanted the Warden to be immune to damage. A mob that can't take damage and would remain statue-like, unmoving, until a player would try to grab its heart, causing it to attack. Sound familiar to any other mob we already know? And if that isn't similar enough for you, take a look at the concept art that Mojang drew for the Stalker. A tall, lanky, asymmetric mob with an orange heart. The Creaking is literally the scrapped Walmart version of the Warden, and that is the final piece of the puzzle that solves this whole mystery. Because there's always been one group of mobs dead set on making Walmart versions of ancient builder inventions, the Illagers. So without further ado, I give you the secret story that Mojang has been hiding. The true story of the Creaking. The ancient builders, ruined by their hubris and fear, created something they couldn't control, a guardian that went rogue and drove them into permanent hiding in the end. But they weren't the last ones to see these cities. Certain villagers had always been fascinated by the magic of the ancient builders, and for this they were shunned by the other villagers who wished not to dabble in the occult. These exiled villagers watched the ancient builders build giant monuments, create life out of nothing, and they were hooked by the magic that these builders seemed to possess. So when they disappeared into the end, the villagers tried to recreate that exact magic. They created mansions in an attempt to study what the builders had left behind, building fake end portals to try and replicate the same sorcery they had witnessed. But it was never enough. They just couldn't create life like the builders could. That is, until they went deeper. One day, a villager patrol discovered an underground city, and they knew that this place must have been created by the builders. They set up their own outposts, building into the ruins of the ancient city. They saw the skull catalyst the builder had left behind and were in awe. A block that could siphon the life force out of anything that died around it. They knew they had to try again, to make the magic they had failed so many times to recreate. They went back to their dark oak forests and began experimenting, far away from any of their mansions. And after enough testing, They did it. They managed to extract the life force out of the trees around them in the form of resin. With this life essence now in their control, they could finally do what the builders could: manipulate the energy of life itself. They created a block, a heart based off the Sculk catalyst, a hub of energy that could store the life force of natural things, except it was more powerful than they thought. They had created something that was too unnatural, more life force than any block of wood should ever have inside of it, and so it came to life. The Creaking heart needed more life force to sustain itself and began draining the energy out of all the trees around it, converting the once flourishing dark forest into a lifeless, pale garden. And if it made all this dark brown wood turn gray, who's to say it didn't do the exact same thing to the skin of the villagers that created it? It was taking their life force away too. The now Illagers were frightened. They had made something far too strong, something they couldn't control anymore. So they took out their axes. They had to destroy this thing before it destroyed them. But the Creaking heart was even stronger than they had thought. It pooled together all the life force it had sucked out of the dark forest and created a puppet to protect itself. The Illagers had done too good of a job. They had studied the catalyst too well, and now they were facing a warden of their own creation, reminded of the horrors they encountered in the deep dark and terrified of what had stolen their life force. The Illagers ran, horrified of the monster that now stood in front of them. To the Illagers, the Creaking is a reminder of an experiment gone rogue, an attempt to harness and recreate the magic that the builders seemed to wield, magic that wiped the builders out and now did the exact same thing to those who followed them. If only they hadn't tried to copy the builders and instead learned from their mistakes, maybe things could have ended differently. And that is the secret of the Creaking that Mojang was hiding. It's not just a new mob, it's a second coming of the Warden, an artificial Frankenstein puppet created by the living Creaking heart. The rogue experiment that stole the life force from a whole biome and turned a group of curious villagers into the now pale and spiteful Illagers we see today. But that's only my theory. That's the best story and interpretation I could come up with given the evidence I was able to find, but maybe you can see another way to connect all the facts and figure out what it is that Mojang isn't telling us. I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments, but with that said, that's all I have for today. If you want to watch me solve the secret of the Warden, then click the video on the left, and if you want to know what happened to the ancient builders after they escaped into the end, then click the video on the right. But thank you so much for watching, please consider subscribing, and peace out, have a good one, I'll see you next time.